Choosing the right sleeping pad is crucial. Have you woken up on a camping or backpacking trip shivering and cold? Being cold is a guaranteed way to be miserable on a trip, but something that you may not have known is that your sleeping pad warmth is just as important as your top insulation like a sleeping bag or quilt. Many of my colder and more miserable nights in the backcountry can be blamed on an inadequate sleeping pad. But after hundreds of nights on dozens of sleeping pads in conditions like 100-degree Fahrenheit deserts to -40 Canadian winters, I've narrowed down a general guide for sleeping pad warmth in order to help you choose a sleeping pad in order to be as comfortable as possible out on your trips. There are two factors that affect how effective your sleeping pad is going to be at keeping you warm. The first factor is air temperature. Most people probably consider air temperature when they're going to buy a sleeping pad and choosing which one is going to be best for the conditions that they're going to be going out in. But air temperature is only a small part of the picture. That being said, air temperature is becoming more and more important as sleeping pads are getting thicker and people are using wider and bigger sleeping pads. That's because a person laying on a 20-inch wide sleeping pad like I have here is going to be covering most of the pad when they're laying on it, especially if they're laying on their back. And if the pad is on the thinner side, something like 2.5 or 3 inches, then not a lot of that pad is going to be exposed to air. Whereas if you have a large, wide sleeping pad that's super thick, you're not going to be covering as much of that sleeping pad with your body and your sleep insulation, then a lot of that sleeping pad is going to be exposed to air and being influenced by air temperature. Air temperature is where most pads run into problems with living up to their advertised R value. R value is a standardized way where they test sleeping pad warmth in a lab. The warmer the sleeping pad, the higher the R value. And the lower the R value, the colder the sleeping pad is going to sleep. Theoretically. But once we get from the lab into real world conditions, sometimes that R value number doesn't add up. And later in the video, I'm going to explain to you some of the ways you can avoid pitfalls when it comes to R value. Even more important than air temperature is the second factor, ground temperature. The entire bottom of your sleeping pad is in contact with the ground. So if the ground is cold and your sleeping pad is cold, then the ground is going to be sucking a lot of heat out of you through the sleeping pad. Frozen ground or snow is obviously going to be very cold. But ground that is wet or has a large amount of water in it is also going to be colder relative to drier ground. During summer and fall, dry ground is going to hold on to a lot of heat from during the day, which is something to keep in mind when you're out planning your trips and choosing what sort of sleeping pad to get. But in springtime, when the ground is still frozen or is really wet from snowmelt, that ground is going to be really cold and you're going to need a warmer sleeping pad, even if the air temperature is the same compared to fall or summer conditions. So what sort of R values are appropriate for different conditions? My guide breaks things up into 3 different ranges of R value and then corresponds those to the types of conditions that you're going to be encountering out on outdoor adventures. We'll start with the warmest conditions that you might encounter out on a trip and then work our way to the coldest. If temperatures are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit and the ground is dry and warm, then an R value range of 2 to 4 is probably going to keep you warm. Pads with an R value between 2 and 4 don't have a ton of insulation in them. They're a lot more compact and lightweight and are usually advertised as summer pads. Some good pads in this range are the Sea to Summit Etherlite XT and the XPED Ultra 3R. But the Big Agnes Zoom UL also falls into this category based on my real world experience. It has a advertised R value of 4.3, but due to the way that it's constructed, I find that it sleeps closer to about a 2 or 2.5. The reason for the Zoom UL sleeping colder than its advertised R value is due to gaps in the insulation around these weld points, as well as it uses a reflective film for insulation that just kind of falls to the bottom of the pad. So the pad is exposed to a lot of air on the sides and top, and essentially that insulation on the bottom isn't going to be doing a whole lot, especially if the air temperatures are cold. So make sure you're watching reviews of pads where people are using them in real world conditions and kind of pushing them to the limits of their warmth rating to ensure that they're going to be warm enough for you once you actually get them out in. My favorite way to find the right sleeping pad for a trip that I'm going to be going on or to recommend to someone else is to use the Gear Explorer tool at packwizard.com. For tents, packs, quilts, sleeping bags, and sleeping pads, you can sort through and filter thousands of products in order to find the exact one for your needs. Head over to packwizard.com in order to check it out. For most people, I think this next range is going to be the sweet spot for sleeping pad warmth. It's pads with R value between 4 and 6. Pads in this range are going to keep you warm in temperatures from about 20 degrees Fahrenheit up to 50 degrees Fahrenheit when the ground might be wet or a little bit cool. These pads are going to have a decent amount of insulation in them, whether that's synthetic insulation like we see with the XPED 5R that we have here, or reflective film like you see more with the X-Lite pad from Thermarest. These pads are also going to have some way to prevent air from moving around the pad. With the 5R, that's by having the synthetic insulation spread from the bottom of the pad to the top of the pad, filling up that space, preventing air from moving around. Thermarest uses a triangular core matrix technology, which separates the pad into a bunch of different cells, which also prevents air movement, which if you have is going to lead to convective heat loss. All links to all the pads that I mentioned in this video in the video description.
Winter conditions, or if you're out in early spring when temperatures are below 20 degrees Fahrenheit and the ground is still frozen or it's snow covered, then I think you need a sleeping pad with an R value over 6 in order to be comfortable. The only pad that I trust in extreme winter conditions right now is the Thermarest X-Therm. I've tested a lot of other winter rated pads and they just aren't as warm as the X-Therm when used on their own. The X-Therm, like the X-Lite, uses reflective film in order to reflect heat back at you, then the triangular core matrix to separate the pad into cells in order to prevent convective heat loss. Those two insulation systems are extremely effective, and yeah, like I said, the X-Therm is a very warm pad. During extreme cold, I'll stack a foam pad either on top or underneath the X-Therm. R value is additive. So if you have the X-Therm with an R value of about 7.3 and then you have a foam pad with an R value of 2, then that stacks to an R value of 9.3. Go check out this video if you want to see my minus 50 degree sleep system. I used this sleep system out when it was so cold that the oil in my car froze.